Welcome back to the channel. This is a continuation of part 1. If you haven't seen that part, click in the banner above and come back to this video. If we use F5 to run the program, we can see our menu has been printed. We can then type in our menu option, so let's say 1, and it will call print users, and that will return us back with print. We're seeing the number 1 because this, what we enter into the console, is being processed as a string, and then we run some code that will try and convert it into an integer. And what we're seeing here is the value that is being converted from this input to this output, and we can see the word print come up because we are trying to print all of the users. And in the last video we didn't cover the implementation for these functions, so we'll be doing that now. So just after all of our menu options, if we scroll down, we can see the function placeholders that we made in the previous video. So we have a print all, an add, an edit, a search, and a remove. So let's start to build the print. So the goal of this function is to be able to print the values inside our people, which will be a list of persons. So all the persons will be stored inside people, and the definition for a person is just simply a name and an age, and we can add more to this in the future should we want to. So several different ways that we can do this, and let's explore one of the complicated ones first. So we have the people object here, and if we press enter and then press full stop, we've got this list. And as you can see, this star is Visual Studio suggesting the ones that it thinks that we're going to use. The one I'm going to demonstrate first is a for each. So you can do for each, and what this will try and do is it'll try and run an action for each of the elements inside the list. So there's two ways that we can run this code using this for each action. The first one is rather complicated and it covers delegates very shortly. So we can make something called a delegate, and this will act as a mini function just inside these curly braces. So what we can do is we can actually write our function code. We can write the code inside these curly braces, and it will actually process a function that is defined inside the parentheses around the for each. So all we need to do, because we're printing out the users, is just type cw tab, and then because our parameter that we're getting passed in the function is called person, we have our return details function here that returns the name and the age. So that's all we want to do. So we can just type in here person.return details. So this will go through all of the items inside the people object, and it'll run this function on them. For every item that iterates through, it will pass it into this delegate, which is just like a mini function, into this parameter, and then our console write line will pick it up here. So now if we try to run this code and press 1, you'll see that there's still no one entered. The reason for that is because we have no users in the system, and because we haven't implemented add user yet, let's just hardcode some users. After you've initialized the people object, what you can do is just before the semicolon, you can place some curly braces, and then you can actually define some hard-coded people in here. So we can type in new person, and then we have access to the values. And instead of having a semicolon like you normally would do, this would be a comma delimited list. So you could place a comma here. If you put your cursor at the end and then use Ctrl D, you can copy the line. So you can say aber23, and then we can just have a test account 10. And then if we wanted to add more, then we can just keep pressing Ctrl D and then change the values inside here, but we'll just stick for 2 for the time being. So now that we have 2 bits of data in here, let's just run our code and see what happens when we use the 1 option. As you can see, we have the data coming back now, which is great. So let's try and tidy up this option a little bit. Let's get rid of the number that comes back, and let's get rid of the print value. So the print value is just here, and then the integer output that comes back is just inside here. So now if you run the code again, we can see it looks a lot cleaner. What would be really handy is if we had 1 dot and 2 dot before these, just to show us how many people are in the list. So there's a couple of ways we can do this. We could actually define our own integer outside of here. Int I equals 0, and then inside our function we could say I++, and then here we can add the I followed by a full stop and a space, and then followed by the person's details. And now let's try and run this and see what happens. There we go. That looks a lot better because now we see the amount of people in the list. And maybe we want to get rid of the menu because it's kind of making the screen very clogged, especially if you have multiple users on. You don't really want to be scrolling that much. So at the start of this function, we could run a console.clear. And if we try to run that again and type in 1, as you can see there, it's printing all the users without any clogger on the screen. And maybe if you wanted to, you could put a message just at the start, just to introduce the section that you're doing, something on the lines of printing all users, just to add an environment new line, just to give it some space. And there you go, that looks a lot neater. If this method looks a little bit too complicated, let's cover the other ones you may approach. So you could say people for each again, and to do this exact function, but just to make it look a little bit nicer, then we can type it like this, person, and then we can have arrow functions, and we can type in one singular line, just like this one. So we can just type in console write line, and then person.return details. And this will work as the same way as this one. If we wanted to include the I, we'd also need to include the I++. So what you can do, so we can put curly braces around the console write line, and we make it look like the line above. Because right now, if you don't have the curly braces, it only lets you do this one singular line. So let's put curly braces around it, and let's see what it will do. So now it's allowed us to type in multiple lines, and the reason why we've got an error is because now it's expecting a semicolon, because you can add more than one line in here. So if we do I++ inside here, then we can also see that this should print out the same details. And let's just copy this code just so we can print out I. And then if we use a block comment with /* at the start and * / at the end, and let's run this code again. If we type in 1, you can see the output is exactly the same. These two functions are doing the same thing, it's just running a delegate and giving it the parameter is something that's very tedious, and C# thought it would be easier to make a shorthand version just like this. And this is what's called, as it says here, a lambda expression. Other ways of doing this that you're probably more familiar with is something called a for each loop, and we can have person in, and then our people object. And what this means is we're going to be passing in a parameter called person. The type will be person class, and then it's inside our list of persons. And then inside our console write line, we can use the person and type in return details. And again, if we wanted to have the II in there, then we can cut it down and just copy the same output inside here. And then if we just move the star to here to cover both lines in the comment, and then we can run the code and see what happens. Again, as you can see, it's doing the exact same result, but it just depends which one fits you the best. The method that I prefer the most is the one I'm about to cover. So if we actually comment out the integer as well, and I'll show you the method that I like doing the best, and we can do it near the top. This is to write an individual for loop. For int I equals 0, because our lists start at 0, not at 1, we can say I is less than people.count, I++, and then inside the curly braces, we can do our console write line, and then inside the console write line, we're going to be using this local variable I that we've just created. But because it's 0 based, we want to be adding 1 to it, because our list is indeed 0 based when it's stored, but humans like to read it beginning with 1. So we can do I plus 1 plus a full stop and a space and the quotes and then plus. Instead of typing in person like we have been doing here, because that was using the person parameter, we'll be referring to the list again directly. And to refer to a specific position in the list, we can hit the curly brace. As it says there, it lets you access an element based on an index that we give it. So what we can do here is, as we're going around in the for loop, I is the index that we want to use to access the people object. Add a square bracket, and we can type in I inside there. And then once we've done this, that's returned us back one person. Not a list of persons, just one singular person. So just after the square bracket, we can call the function return details. And let's run that code and see what happens. There you go. So it's outputted the same thing for all 4 different iterations of doing this printing, but I genuinely prefer the first option. The reason why I prefer the first option is in all of these options, you'd need to create your own integer outside of the function and then pass it in and then use it inside. Whereas in this for loop, because we already have a counter of I, it will just keep counting and we can use it ourselves instead of having to declare an integer outside. I'll keep this commented just in case you want a reference to it in the source code. So now let's see what happens when we actually finish the menu and press enter. You see that our program closes, so we need to do something about that. So once we've processed the menu option as number 1 and we've hit the PrintAll function, it's going to skip all of these if statements because it's an else if. Once it's found that one of these have returned back true, it will jump to the end of the chain. So after we've pressed enter and finished the PrintAll function, then it's going to return back here, which will have no code in there, and then it'll finish this if statement and jump back down to here, and this will actually just end the function, and the function is just print menu, and once this print menu has ran, then we'll actually be finishing the program because it'll be hitting this console read line, and then our program will be over. So what we want to do is right at the end, either here or at the end, we actually want to just print the menu again. Print menu. So after all of these options have been executed and our code has decided which option it needs to pick, whatever option has finished, it will always hit this line and print the menu again. So let's try the program now. 1, and it's printed our function, and then it's printed out the menu straight after it. Maybe what would be best in here is to clear the console after this, and maybe to add a console read line at the end of the PrintAll function so it doesn't automatically print the menu immediately. So let's do that. Quick tip, if you hold Control and hover over a function, you'll see it'll become blue and underlined. If you click on it, it will jump to the definition just so you don't have to scroll about in your code. So what we can do here is we can say, you have finished this option, press enter to return to the menu. And then we can do a console read line, and then a simple console.clear as well. So now let's run the code and see what happens. Now if you press 1, it says print all users, it gives us all the users, and it tells us we finish this option, press enter to return the menu, and upon pressing enter, we return back to the menu. And we can keep cycling through these, and it'll still work okay. And if we press 2 to add user, then it'll print our add, and it'll loop the menu again, because that's exactly the same behavior that we saw in the PrintAll. So let's start on the add user function and work our way through it. So let's just close the program down. So the AddPerson function, what we want to do is to follow the same approach and copy these 3 lines towards the bottom. But now you need to stop immediately and realize what you've just done. You've took some code that's identical in one place and pasted it identically in another place. As soon as you realize you've done this, then you automatically need to make a function. And it's best to do it at that point because you know you're going to need this in all the other options as well, because we're going to need this here and also here. So let's make a public void finish option, and then we can paste it in here. And then in all of these functions, we can just call finish option. Instead of having to copy and paste them lines of code, should we want to tweak this message, then it'll be a long task to go through all of the functions and tweak them individually, whereas we have one singular part in here. This is the benefit and power of functions. Okay, so let's remove the reference that we have in the PrintAll, and then let's just make sure that that's worked. So we could say 1, and it says you finish these options, and then we could click 2, and it's also doing the same thing, which means it's working fine. What I think we should do is just place an environment new line just before here, just to space it out a little bit. If we try press F5 again, we're in print all users, we have a little gap here, and now it looks a bit better because you're separating the header, the footer, and the main contents of the output, just to give it a bit more structure. So now let's try and do the add user function. So as you can see, we'll still need to apply the same procedure to what we did with the print. So what we can do here, we can copy these 2 lines and paste it at the start of add, and then we can say adding a user. And let's just give that a shot and make sure it's working, adding a user, and then we have a gap here for the contents, and then we have finished the option. Now what you've just realized as well is we've just made another copy and paste, but the only difference was it was actually this string. So maybe we can make another function, but actually give it a parameter this time. So let's say public void start option, and then we can give it a string message. And then if we paste them 2 lines of code in from before, just these 2 here, Because our adding a user is the string that's going to change each time, we can filter that in for the message parameter. So now we can say message. And then when we go to call the AddPerson, we could say start option. And then inside the parentheses, we can add in our string. And now let's do exactly the same thing for the print all. And this one's adding a user, so let's do printing all users and just cut the string in, and then we can remove this line. So you can see we've started the option, we've passed it our custom message, and we've printed the body, and then we finished the option. Now we just make sure that it looks exactly the same, which it does. And if we try option 2 now we can say adding a user, and there's a space for a body, and we have the output. It's all looking correctly, and we're using functions, which is really good. So now what we can do is just go through the other functions and just go through and make this change. So we can say editing a user, searching users, and maybe removing a user. So now we've finished removing all the duplication in our code by using our finish option function. Let's get back to writing the AddPerson function. So let's scroll back up and we can see we have the contents here. We've already finished the PrintAll function, and now it's time to move on to AddPerson. So what do we need to do to add a person? We need to enter a name, enter an age, create a person class, add to the list, return to the menu. Perfect. So to enter a name, we need to output something to the console and let them type a username in, and also for the age, and then we can make an instance of the person class, so we can add the name and age into the constructor, and then we can add it to our people object, and then we can return to the menu. Returning to the menu has already been taken care of by the finish option function. As you can see here, what this function will do is it will print to the console saying you have finished this option, press enter to return to the menu, and once it hits this line, it will wait for the enter, it will clear the console, and then in the menu function, it will finish all of these branches and hit the print menu. So we don't have to necessarily worry about return to the menu inside these functions, because these functions are only concerned about the functionality, because returning to the menu is taken care of outside. So let's remove this bullet point and let's get started on these. So in order to enter a name, we can do CW tab and just remove the line, and we can say enter a name, :space, and then we can read it in, name input, as a console read line, and that's pretty straightforward. Reading in an age will be something similar to reading in a name, except we need to convert it to an integer, which will be our age, from the console read line, which is our string. So let's change this up. Let's create an int and rename this to age input. And then instead of having a console read line, because this is a string and it can't directly convert it straight using the equal sign, we'll need to wrap this in a convert to int32. There we go. So what we're telling it in this line is we want to convert whatever the value is that comes back from the console read line. And as we've shown in the print menu function, this is technically an unsafe conversion, because if I were to enter something like hi into here, it will actually crash the program. Just in the interest of time, I will not convert this into a try parse just to make the code easier and the video shorter. But if you would like to, then it's best to jump back into the menu function and see what we did here with the try parse. Try parse will always make it safe because you'll make sure that there's no exceptions in your code. Instead, what I'll include here is something called a try catch. I covered this in my exceptions video if you want to click on the banner to gain more understanding. So what we can do, we can type in try, and once you see this code snippet come up, we can enter tab twice and it'll give us the exception handler straight away. So we can cut this code inside here, and what we can do is we can say when we hit an exception, all we want to do is print to the user something has went wrong, press enter to try again. And what we can do here is we can do a console read line, so we can process that enter key and then simply recall AddPerson. We could just recall AddPerson. The only thing we'll be left to do here is to actually clear the console first, because nothing else is clearing it for us. There we go. So if we do seem to have any issues in here, and the issues will only come from this conversion. So let's just give this a test to make sure it works. So hit F5 to load the program. We can press 2 for our user, enter a name, Abba, and enter a name. I need to change that value. And let's just say hi, and as you can see it says something went wrong, press enter, try again, And there we go, it's looped back around until we've actually typed in correct values, and then it'll continue. So let's change this value to enter an age. And now that we've gained both of the values and everything has succeeded down here, we can make a new person. Let's say person equals new person, and then for the name we type in name input, and for the age we can do age input, and then that's it. That's our person has been created. So we've validated the name and the age, and that's been okay, but we've only validated them to include their values. So what we could do now for any further validation is actually make sure they've typed something in. So we can say if, and we have this library that we can use by string dot, and it has lots of functions inside here that we can use. The most popular one that you'll realize you'll use a lot is this is null or empty. So we can type in is null or empty, and then inside these parentheses we'll be giving it the value that we're going to be checking. Now what this if statement now reads in English is if the string that we're trying to check, which is called name input, is null or empty, then this will return back true if it either contains nothing or the value of the variable is actually indeed null. So in this case, we want to actually do this branch if it's not null, which means it contains something that's not this or this, which can be any values like ABBA, or even a single character. So this will just check that they've included an actual value inside the name and not just left it blank. And now inside here, we want to check if the age input is actually valid. Any number that's hit this line and not throw an exception will technically be valid. There's no point in the user typing in -1 for their age because that's impossible. So what we can do instead is we can say if the age input is greater than or equivalent to 0, and we can say the max age is something like 150. So if they've entered a name, and if the age input is between 0 and 150, then we can call our new person, and then we can do people, which will be our list of persons, and then we press dot, we have access to the add function, we can add a person, and that person is the person that we just made. And now what we can do on the else of both of these branches, we can add some else branches here, and we could just say in here, we want to let the user know what they've really messed up on. So if they fell into this branch and this is returned false, that means they haven't entered anything for the name. That doesn't necessarily mean it's an exception, it's just something we want to prevent because we don't want to add users in our system with empty names. So we can do CW tab tab, and we can say, you didn't enter a name, try again. And then we can follow this same approach, and we can do a console read line, and we can clear the console, and we can add the person. If you wanted to, you can also add this on the end as well, just to make it concise. And as you can see here, we're also hitting another problem where we're having duplicate amounts of code. So let's take a quick break from this and just quickly go and make that function and just come back to this. The finish option method is very similar to the first 3 lines that we have in here, except it contains a different message. So what we could do separate to this is create another function, a public void output message, and we can actually give this a string message. Maybe let's move it away from these two because these two are together. The order doesn't necessarily matter, but it's good to keep your code structured. So what we can do in here is actually state the message, and then we can add this ending, which will be please try again. And this is perfect because we know that in every single situation that we've used this before, we've always did this ending. So what we can do now is do a console.readline and a console.clear, and then we can replace this function above in our duplication code. So what we can do in here for the output message is all we need to do, since we have clear defined, the read line defined, and we have this section of the string defined up until the first full stop, we can delete that, and then what's left over is what we can take and put that inside our output message. So now let's do the same for this part. Output message, and then we can open the strings, and it's just this section that we need to get, and we can actually get rid of the rest of the lines, since again it's following the same approach. Let's just have a quick scan through our code and make sure we don't have this format anywhere else, and it looks like we don't. We do have something very similar up here, and it actually puts it on both lines. Let's make this consistent and we'll add this in as well. So we can add the incorrect menu choice, and actually we chose to do it on 2 separate lines before, but it'll be a bit cleaner if we do it all in one. So now we can replace all this with a semicolon. And let's just make sure that this still works. So let's try and trigger this output message. So it's the else branch, but let's see what it's the else of. So if you click on this little curly brace, it will actually give you a little tooltip there to tell you where the if statement is. Or you could follow it up and see where the other curly brace is that's highlighted. So if try parse, and this will only return false if the conversion has been unsuccessful. So what we can do, when we're loading up the menu, we can type in hi. Incorrect menu choice, press enter to try again, press enter and it takes us back, so it seems to be working. Now let's test our AddPerson. So in order to trigger this one message, we'll have to leave the name blank. So press number 2, and we'll say enter a name, and we can just press enter, and then for the age it needs to be successful, just so our code doesn't break. So if you press enter, you can see you didn't enter a name, try again. Press enter to try again. So of course we don't want to include this as well, so let's change that string. So now if we press enter, we'll see the code did indeed work. So let's press Ctrl C and exit. And now we can remove this and just replace it with a full stop. And then we can add this in for the age clause as well. So if the age is out of bounds, then we can say enter a sensible age. And let's try and run that again. So we can select number 2, we can enter a name Abba, and we can select age of 160. Press enter to try again. And we can try that again, and we can do -10. As you can see, it still works. And if you do Abba and 10, now it says you finish this option because it successfully added someone. So let's just print out our meshes to make sure that the user knows what's actually happened, because it doesn't look like anything's happened here. So I just noticed a little bug that I want to introduce you to. So if you want to add the user, and let's say we enter the name, but we also type in this incorrect. It says something has went wrong, press enter, try again. So we press enter and we type it in correctly this time. And now it's a bit to add them, but obviously we don't have that message yet, but it has indeed actually executed this line of code. But what happens now, when it says you have finished this option, press enter to return to the main menu, I will press enter, and look what's happened. It's cleared the console, and it's also printed this message out again, which is very confusing because it looks like it's printed this finish option twice, except we only have this function defined at the end of this method. That's really strange. Or is it really strange? What happens when you catch an exception? I will demonstrate that in a debug. So if we input the debug statement just above here, and we can run the code, 2 for add user, and then let's step in using F10, and then it hits the read line, so let's enter a value, and then go back into the code, and we hit the second read line for the age, and let's trigger the exception, so now it jumps down into here, and we can press F10 to jump, then it prints out the message something went wrong, press enter to try again. When I press enter, it will call the AddPerson function again, and it'll jump back to the start of the function, which is the behavior we'd expect. But let's see what happens when we try and enter a name now. So let's enter a name, and that works fine. And then let's actually enter a real life value, which is 23, so we don't trigger the exception. And if we go through this list, you'll see that we've hit the new person. Our person does include the right details, and we've added them to the people, and now we actually have 3 people in here just because I was demonstrating them values. And then look what happens. We hit the end of the try, which is perfect, and then we hit the finish option code, and then that's why you see it here. But when I press enter again, look what's happened. We've jumped back in here, but once I press F10, it jumps back into the exception. And then it calls the finish option yet again. This is a problem because we don't want to be showing this twice to the user. And now it's jumped back in the menu after I press enter the second time. So we only want to show this once. And the reason why this is happening is after the exception is fired, it will jump back to the start of the AddPerson function because we've called it here. But after the function has finished executing, it will go back and finish from this line until the end. We don't want that in this case. We only want to run finish option if the output has been successful. So we can actually move that and put it just underneath our AddPerson, and it should still work fine. So let's follow that same approach and see what happened. And let's just take our breakpoint out, and then press F5 to continue with the program. And let's trigger the exception. Then press enter again and type the correct values this time. And now that we've finished the option and press enter again, it does indeed take us back to the menu. So now, if you want to make this code a little bit nicer, then instead of making a variable, then just adding that variable straight into there, you could actually type everything after the equals straight into here, and it'll do exactly the same thing. This is just a little bit neater, but it does involve two operations at once, and this might be slightly confusing if you're new to this. So if you want to keep it as separate variables, that's also fine too. So now that we've finished our print and our add, let's actually try and use the program to see what's going on. So we can print a user, and we can actually see there's two currently. So let's remove the hard-coded values that we added in before. What you can do just to comment this out is you can start your block comment here and finish it here, and the semicolon will still finish this line, so the program will still run. So hit F5, and then if we print the users, we can see that there's nothing in here. So what we can do add user number 2, and then we can type in AddPerson, press enter, and let's add in one more, test 20. And then if we go back to the menu and print 1 again, you can see that I've actually printed successfully, which is perfect. So now just a couple of things. When we printed the users the first time, when the system was blank, this just showed nothing. So let's add a quick if statement just to give the user a bit of feedback if there's nothing on the screen. So what we can do in here is we can say if people.count equals 0, then what we can do is print something to the screen. So we can have an else in here, and inside that else is when the count is not equal to 0. So let's put our for loop inside, because that will start to print the users if there is more than 0 users in the system. So we could just print a message in, there are no users in the system. Use option 1 to create a user. There we go. That's how simple it needs to be. Now if you run the code again with a fresh system and press number 1, you can see that it says that message now, so we don't have to be confused. And when we add a user, we can just add a successful message. So if we use Ctrl+C to quit the program and scroll down to here, we know that it's been successfully added here. So just before the finish option, we can do CW tab, successfully added a person. And that's it. And let's just give that a quick test. AddPerson, and now we've gave feedback to the user to tell them what they've done. So now we can enter to get back to the menu, and let's start making the edit user function. So inside the EditPerson, we need to check if people in system, print all, allow selection, validate selection, edit user, print message, return back to the menu. Perfect. So now that we've figured out what we need to do for EditPerson, let's finish this part here and have a quick recap before we finish the video. So we added an output message function, and you can see the definition by holding Control and pressing on the message, and you can see it jumps to here. So we have a string message, and that gets inserted inside the write line, and it will always print out, press enter to try again, and a read line followed by clear. And this is actually used in quite a lot of occasions. So if we go back, in this occasion it says the incorrect menu choice. It's when you select a value that is not in the list, or you actually cause an exception to occur because the value cannot be converted. So that's when it'll print incorrect menu choice. We've also added in a simple if statement that just checks how many people are in the system, and if there's none in the system, it lets you know, because the user will expect users to be printed in this option. And if they don't, they might think something is wrong with the system, because if the people.count is actually 0, then 0 to 0 will not run this for loop, therefore no people will be printed, and the user might think something has went wrong. So informing them of something that's happening within the system, even if it's simple as saying that there's no one there, at least they know what's going on. We finalized the AddPerson function, we read in the name, the age, and we wrapped it inside our try catch to make sure if they add in a value for age that was something like hi, then this will crash the convert in 32, and the catch will check it, output something has went wrong, and then recall AddPerson, and it'll reset back to here. After both value has been converted successfully and the string has been read in successfully, we'll check the string to make sure it contains something like A or just anything. If it's null, or if it's empty like this, then this code will return false, and it will jump down into this bracket and it'll say you didn't enter a name and then loop back around. And if our age range is not sensible, like -1 or something like 160, then these two values will trigger the output message to say enter a sensible age, and again it will loop around to start the cycle again. If all of these checks have been successful, then we create a new person using our name and age input, we add the person to our list of people, and then we just print a message to let the user know what's happening with the system, and then we finish the option. So let's finish that part here, and let's pick up the EditPerson in the next part. Don't forget to subscribe to make sure you don't miss the next part. I'll see you in the next one. I'm going to be making a C# course coming up soon, so keep your eye out. In the meantime, if you want to check out my Patreon to support the channel, I'd greatly appreciate it.